Welcome to Preaching Unpacked. I'm Randall Parton, the senior pastor here at St. John's United Methodist Church in Albuquerque, New Mexico.
And I'm Tiffany Hollums. I'm the associate pastor here.
During Preaching Unpacked, we look at last week's sermon. We talk about some takeaways that we hope folks got from the sermon. We talk about things that didn't quite make it into the sermon, the things that got left on the cutting room floor, or rabbits that we didn't chase in preparation for the sermon. We talk about things that are coming up in the next week and just talk about theological topics along the way. So let's open with prayer this morning. Let's pray. O God, whose glory it is always to have mercy, be gracious to all who have gone astray from your ways and bring them again with penitent hearts and steadfast faith to embrace and hold fast the unchangeable truth of your word, Jesus Christ, your Son, who with you and the Holy Spirit lives and reigns, one God, forever and ever. Amen. So we are doing a series during Lent that we're calling The Healing Journey. And we're looking at mostly interpersonal relationships, but also how we relate to others and how others in the world relate to each other. Our topic this last Sunday was on invalidation, which happens a lot.
Yeah.
And we looked at the Passion narrative, specifically how when Jesus was arrested and brought before Pilate, afterwards, the guards take Jesus and they mock him. You know, they put a crown of thorns on his head. They put a robe on him, and they put a reed in his hand, and they say, "Hail, King of the Jews." And we lifted that up as an example from the Passion narratives of just the kind of mocking and dehumanizing that happens in this particular narrative as a way for us to look at some of the ways, big ways and small ways that invalidation happens in our lives and in our world, and what we can do about that and how we sort of react and respond to that. Real quickly, the text that I looked at is from Matthew's Gospel. This is from Matthew 27, starting at verse 27. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the governor's headquarters, and they gathered the whole cohort around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, and after twisting some thorns into a crown, they put it on his head. They put a reed in his right hand and knelt before him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." They spat on him and took the reed and struck him on the head. After mocking him, they stripped him of the robe and put his own clothes on him, and then they led him away to crucify him. So invalidating, dehumanizing. Some of the subtle ways. I talked a little bit about, just how easy sometimes it is in relationships to not hear each other, especially if, our partner or the other person in the relationship is struggling or in pain or wrestling with something, and we don't hear it, we don't notice it, or we're just kind of casually dismissive of it. We just don't, it doesn't sort of affect us, or we don't respond in ways that are affirming, I guess is what I was trying to say. Yeah. And then, of course, we see it on a grand scale with things like genocide and conquest and slavery and race relations and, all the ways that we other others, and that it's just sort of kind of sewn into our psyches. I talked about the Stanford prison experiment and how quickly in this infamous experiment, college students turned on each other, and they were playing roles of guards, prison guards and prisoners, and within 36 hours, one of the students had a nervous breakdown.
Right.
And they had to shut the whole thing down because it just so spiraled so quickly, where these people who have been told that they were prison guards were treating the prisoners as unhuman, as
and it said they strip searched them.
Yes.
I'm like, what in the world kind of research was this?
Yeah. It was 71, and this is obviously pre-human subjects, sort of, IRB kind of stuff. But but it was pretty hardcore. But I think one of the things that I said is that just you can't do this kind of experiment anymore. Obviously, thank God. But how powerful to show how quickly you can turn people against each other by just simply categorizing them giving them expectations that you're not supposed to call them by name anymore. They are, other. And then you think about, I didn't mention this in the sermon, this is something that got left on the cutting room floor, but the sort of the Nuremberg kind of defense, right, which I was just following orders, right? And how far would you go to follow orders in ways that both dehumanize somebody else, but actually you sacrifice your own humanity, your ability to see the other person as a real human being. That
it does something to your soul.
That's right.
Your humanity when you do that to others.
Yeah.
Wow. It was really striking to me, especially when you were reading through the list of all of that. I was like, oh my gosh, it really is. It's also so much of what I think we've experienced the past couple of years, especially with all of the race trials and, it's, even things like, the anniversary of Trayvon Martin's murder was here. And it's like there was this picture that just really struck me where he just had this package of Skittles.
Yeah.
And that it's so easy, as you said, to other someone else with kind of filling in the details that you don't know about them.
Yeah, and I think, I think I alluded to this in the sermon, but not directly, and that is, I think, one of the unfortunate consequences of many during the pandemic is because we've been so isolated from each other for so long. Part of what's important about not othering others is actually being with others and interacting and seeing people with whom you disagree as human beings with, with joys and cares and sorrows and, things that make them happy and things that make them frustrated. And you see them as, you can empathize with them. And I think our ability to empathize has been really compromised because we've been so separated from each other in so many different ways. And we're just seeing some of these conflicts, some of these disputes playing out on a screen as opposed to in 3D real life among people with whom we are rubbing elbows and sharing life.
Well, and I think, what we're seeing in Ukraine as well in social media is that we're able to see up close the effects of war that we've never been able to see before like this. And it's striking. It's really, you don't want to see that. But it's right there. It's really this strange juxtaposition of, we were so removed, but now we're right up close, having information and images and situations brought to us that we don't have the capacity a lot of times to be able to handle.
Yeah, and I worry about that too. I worry about how we can get numbed to things sometimes, or how we can be provoked sometimes by what we're seeing. It becomes, we sort of become immune to it. We inoculate ourselves from the horror of the disputes sometimes, or it stirs us up in ways that also feel kind of dehumanizing, right? And I think that's really, maybe we could do a whole sermon series on what it means to be fully human, right? And what a fully formed human might be like, as opposed to how we present ourselves on social media or what we consume from social media.
Well, and how even with scripture that we do that. I think that we can easily dehumanize Jesus. In this scripture, it's like he's stripped, he's beaten, he's, and you hear those words, and sometimes it's really helpful for me just to read scripture with children because their responses.
It's fresh, right? They've not sort of worn the rough edges off through familiarity.
Yes.
So it is very fresh for them.
It is, and their imaginations are so vivid. That it's easy to read the scriptures and just be like, oh, and they put a crown of thorns on his head, and it's like, no, that is brutal, just in the way that they treated Jesus, and that you get the impression I would love to imagine what Jesus is like, but you get this impression he's kind and gentle and humble, and they're doing this.
Yeah. Well, and we talked about this on Ash Wednesday, which we didn't unpack because it was an Ash Wednesday service, not a Sunday service. But escalation was the first kind of destructive behavior, and how over the top things are. I mean, and we see this in this story as well. I mean,
Yes.
they did not have to mock him. They did not have to put a crown of thorns on his head. It's just so disproportionate to what the moment really called for.
Right.
And how we do that in our relationships sometimes too, right? We blow things out of proportion. Our response is not proportionate to the original slight, and it sort of creates this ratcheting up and this kind of this rapid escalation of conflicts and disputes. And then invalidation sometimes is simply just ignoring it, right?
Well, and what are the root emotions or things that are behind those? I mean, I think with escalation, it's fear. With invalidation, it's indifference or selfishness.
That's good. Yeah.
You're just thinking of yourself. And I've noticed that in youth group. I mean, youth group is fascinating. I mean, it's like a psychologist's dream, that it's kind of like Lord of the Flies in a small microcosm, And it's been really interesting to see them coming back and trying to figure out how to be together.
Yes.
And it is just, they are such a hot mess.
Yeah.
And
I think we all are right now, though. I mean, honestly, we talked about this before, but I mean, we went to Pope Joy for a show, and it still feels like it's weird that we're together here, and none of us know how to behave and how to
They don't.
We've been so desocialized.
Yes.
We're all slightly feral, I think, at this point.
Yeah, very feral.
Yeah.
And I mean, teenagers always have a feralness about them, but it's just,
Extra.
Oh my goodness. It really is fascinating, and trying to think of, how do you help, as particularly teenagers and children, how do you help them to be able to feel comfortable? Like, I've found I've had to really be intentional about the welcoming atmosphere and how you integrate them, and I find myself, like, it makes me incredibly anxious, because I mean, as soon as they walk in the door, like, I can tell they're like, and so really like working with creating an environment where they feel safe to come,
which is so important,
and that it's okay, like, it's okay that they're squirrely. And so, part of what I've had to find is kind of living into my own squirreliness. I think it kind of helps, and I think that's that vulnerability in, invalidation. It's kind of moving from being like, oh, well, I'm removed from this, to entering into it with people.
Right. So moving from the kind of indifference to the like acceptance. I mean, that's one of the things that I hope was a takeaway, is encouraging people to be more affirming of the other, and more affirming, even if you don't agree or understand. I mean, it's not, like, who could possibly get in the mind of a teenager walking in the door from the day that they've just had, and you don't have to understand that.
No.
You don't have to comprehend it, but you can sort of be welcoming and affirming and supportive of them in whatever shape they come in the door as.
Yes.
And I wish more of us were able to do that, or at least be sensitive and try. And I think
and the
that's
things
what's
that
so
are
hard.
important to them, I think it's, realizing, when a little kid comes to you and is like, oh, I saw a butterfly and their wings fell off, and their heart is broken, we think, oh, well, just get ready, you'll see a billion of those happen. But no, like, for them, that's real.
Yes. Yeah.
And how you do that is really profound.
So what I hear you saying is that we should have more of our folks working with the youth on a regular basis, just to sort of, this is exposure therapy, to help them be more affirming that they would.
Yes. I mean, it's just, I think for me, it's really listening to them, getting to know them, the funny things that they say, and I think that that's a lot of, people just want to be seen. Like you were saying, they just want to be seen. They want to be heard. They want to know that you care about them. I'll have some of them look at me like, you're talking to me like yeah, no, like, how are you?
Right,
You know,
right.
I notice it with servers and
Yes.
at restaurants and at, you know, like, I asked this one guy, I was like, how was your day? And he was like, I never have somebody ask me that.
Yeah.
But it's, I think we see people just as transactional sometimes.
Yes, and I think we've done that a lot during the pandemic, right?
Yes.
And because it's not clear, am I safe with you? You know, are we safe here? Are we safe together? So we're also guarded, and I think that that's created the kind of barriers that just makes it hard to be more empathetic, more affirming.
Yeah.
You know, to see the other as a human being. That's one of the things. Not to get too far ahead, but I'm wrestling with talking about this coming week, which is how hard it's been to navigate this particular season in our life together, both in the church but in our culture, because none of us have ever lived through a pandemic before. You know, like 99.9% of us have never lived through a pandemic before, and we don't know all that we need to know, and so we're all doing the best we can with the information we have, all of us. If we're, you know, super safe and wear masks all the time, if we don't want to wear a mask, or, you know, people who are vaccinated, people who are not vaccinated. I mean, I think it's important for us to, and this looks ahead a little bit to Sunday, is assume that everybody's trying to do their best,
Yes.
right? And that people aren't trying to be horrible people. I mean, there
Right.
are times when people behave horribly, but I don't know that most people are actually going out of the way trying to be horrible.
It's like, I don't think it's our default to be horrible.
No.
And it's been interesting for me, even just personally, with coming from the pandemic, you know, and especially moving to where it's really it's stark to people when I share about my experience with COVID, you know, because it's like, oh wow, like that wasn't their experience at all. And I think if we just give the chance, like, to hear people and hear where they're coming from, like, it makes things make a lot more sense, you know?
Yes, and I think an important part of it is, just thinking out loud here, is listening to each other, right? And maybe listening a little less to the people who are telling us stuff all the time,
Yes.
but listening to each other
Yes.
is the important part of it.
It
Because
is.
I mean, I've talked a little bit about sort of the media industrial complex a few months ago, and I think that there is, and again, I don't think it's intentional or sort of horrible by design, or that it's that, but I do think that our sort of steady diet of what we consume in terms of news, media,
Yes.
social media, does have a negative consequence for us.
And who we surround ourselves
Exactly,
with.
and who we listen to, and who we pay attention to, and who helps us frame, you know, what's happening in the world, what's happening in our lives. There was a really fascinating social media. This was a tweet, actually a tweet thread from somebody who is a college professor, and he talks about how important language is in terms of framing concepts and events. And the
Yes.
example that he used is I think he's a media professor, so he teaches, you know, radio, TV, media stuff. And they were talking about how, as events in Ukraine were unfolding, to pay attention to the word choice, especially in newspapers,
Yes.
but also in TV news. Is this a conflict? Is this war between Ukraine and Russia? Is this an invasion? And those words, which all describe kind of what's happening with different levels of precision, also shade and nuance what we are seeing, what we think is actually happening.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And I think that was a perfect example in sort of real time for his students to be tracking this and watching how these events are being framed in this way or that way, not with bias or partisan slant or anything,
Right.
but just almost through like the carelessness of word choice, or the lack of sort of, you know, describing this as an invasion as opposed to a conflict,
Right.
it makes a difference.
It does. And, I always tell, when I would work with foster parents, that your framing story is very, very important.
Yeah.
Of how you frame things, particularly for children.
Right.
And that, kids really do pick up on your cues, and so, especially moving into next week of like assuming, you make assumptions of people, you have your lens on that you view things through. And I think so many of us might not be aware of that. And that was really kind of when I started sharing about my COVID experience. Well, part of it was I didn't have the strength to be able to tell more than one person how I was, because they were all worried. I was like holed up in this hotel room. So I was like, I have it in me once. But also just seeing and hearing the news versus my experience, what I was experiencing,
right.
what I was knowing on a firsthand basis to be true. And I felt just compelled to let people know, especially in those early days when people really didn't know what it was, didn't know what was happening. And moving into invalidation, I mean, the responses that I would then get of, well, no. And I'm like, no, like, you can argue against, philosophically of something you see or scientifically that you don't agree with, whatever, but personal experience of someone living that is very difficult to refute.
Well, but we do.
We
right?
do.
I mean, we do. I mean, this is why I think conversations around race are so complicated in our culture, because it's hard to hear some of these things sometimes.
Yes.
It's hard to sit through people's experiences
Right.
and really affirm what they're experiencing, the lenses through which they have seen the world and experienced the world. Particularly if it's something that makes us uncomfortable, is so very different from our experience, our understanding, those kinds of things. And I think we all have a habit of overgeneralizing from our experience to others, and we judge others based on how we've experienced the world, as opposed to how letting people describe how they've experienced the world on their own.
Yes.
And I think, we always did this with our kids growing up, is I kept saying, there's a really wide range of normal. Right.
Yeah.
And teenagers especially are whether implicitly or explicitly, they want to sort of feel normal, to feel like they're not weird or different, or and I just kept saying to both of my kids, it's like, normal is a really, really wide stream.
It is.
And from from infancy on, there is a wide range of normal. And in terms of human behavior, there's a wide range of normal. And in terms of human experiences, there's a wide range of normal. And we want to sort of narrow it down and kind of, and normalize, right? Especially our experiences.
Yeah.
That we don't leave room for a lot of things that are really just how people have lived life and how they've experienced life. It might be different from you, but it's not wrong. It's not not extraordinary. It's just their life.
It is.
And their experiences. And some of what's really, I think, important, particularly in this moment where we find ourselves with such division and polarization, with such a struggle to kind of come back together through the pandemic, is to really kind of create some space for us to listen to each other better, to acknowledge the differences of experiences. I hope, and I think that there's a real kind of opportunity through the pandemic, because one of the things that was fascinating to me, especially early on, is how different people processed the threat and the risk and how we accommodate this so very differently. It's like all of a sudden, the normal categories of where you could align people and how they fit together, you just had to throw them out the window, because you had to take everybody at face value in terms of how comfortable they were with risk, how they assessed risk, evaluated risk, how they mediated risk. I mean, and it's just been fascinating. And I really hope that we can kind of, with a little bit of self-reflection, look back on that and say, that's true with
Everything.
It's true with race, it's true with gender, it's true with how we interact with each other, it's true when we disagree, it's true when we
Yes.
agree, that we are all sort of navigating, and the things that we think separate us into us and them, this group or that group, are really very slippery when you start kind of pressing on them a little bit, and you recognize, oh my gosh, we're all this sort of messy muddling through. Yes. Which affirms our common humanity, because we're all doing that, right? And so let's just
offer each other grace
and sit in that for a little bit longer, So maybe I'll talk a little bit about that.
It's been really fascinating. I mean, it's just the whole time during the pandemic, there's this weird part of me that's like, this is fascinating. Like, this is historic. We're never going to experience something like this again. And how do you, just from a human nature standpoint, just watching how people have reacted and responded and navigated that is endlessly fascinating to me, you know?
I found it really fascinating, and I think I may have said this elsewhere, how there was this sort of innate desire for us to all calculate risk, right? And we are just so terrible at it. I mean, as a species, we're just really, really terrible at assessing risk. And this is why, casinos are so popular and so prosperous, is because people do not understand how to how to live with risk and odds and probabilities, and we all sort of have our shortcuts in ways we sort of we try and play the odds in everything all the time.
Yes.
But it just became really clear how we are every one of us is on our own sort of little timetable with our own little calculators in our brains, trying to figure out, okay, how much can I get away with without killing myself?
I mean, it's, and I think what was really fascinating to me is at the start of the pandemic, my job was as a caseworker to go in and assess risk. And really, for me, having to lean into that in a very personal way of assessing my risk of, something really profound happens when you realize that you are a risk to others. That was the part that was probably really hard. Difficult for me, was that I felt like I was a risk to my family and to the people that I love. And my solution was completely take that risk off the table. Like, I knew I could not mitigate staying in my bedroom and keeping myself locked away, knowing myself. There was no way I could do that without, wanting to take care of people or whatever. And it's like the only thing I could think of in that split-second decision where I found out my coworkers had tested positive to packing up my stuff and heading to a hotel was that I knew that in this situation, the risk that I was mitigating was myself.
So were there other people at the hotel who were also COVID campers?
No.
Okay.
No. And so, I mean, I stayed in my room, and when I left, I took all of my laundry and did it at the laundromat. And, it was I was very aware of just that I was the risk.
Yeah. And I think, and maybe that is part of the experience of the pandemic that was really, really outside of most people's experiences before, is that it wasn't just, what can I get away with to protect myself, but also what are the consequences of me just existing
on
for
my family,
for the people that I care about, and the
it
people
was
I love.
huge. I mean, it's just in my mind, I found I slipped into that thing of when I walk into a home and I'm like, are the things that are their spices expired? Is there whatever? And I was doing that with myself.
Yeah.
And just thinking, okay, if they bring me food, the food is going to go this way. At that point, you didn't know how was it transmitted, and I just was like, no, I have to leave.
Yeah.
And it was really, that for me was the most difficult part. Even before I got sick, I'm going into homes to keep other people safe, assessing the risk there, but then figuring out that risk going back into my home. I remember I would just strip down in the garage and go run in and shower. And at work, it just, to me, that was, actually like just a really formative experience of, I think for me, like learning just to trust my gut, that people will be like, oh, Tiffany, like, should you really? And no, as the time went on, I was like, no, like I need to trust my gut on this, and it's fascinating to me how this time has and will continue to impact us.
Definitely. For years and years and years. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And, and we were talking a little bit about this earlier. I mean, I'm so amazed that 2 years out, how much that we've learned about a transmission, we've learned a lot about risk and how to mitigate risk, not enough really, and we have vaccines now and treatments now, and we've understood how to, if somebody gets COVID, how to treat them better, whereas early on it was just such a new thing. And I think, what a wonderful thing, I mean, aside from the tragedy of losing all these people, but what a wonderful sort of insight to the sort of the human capacity to figure stuff out, make stuff better, make life possible, make health possible under these circumstances. It's
incredible. I mean, and again, like I feel like I've had a really unique seat in this whole thing of, going to my doctor and saying, okay, this and this and this is happening, and them saying to me, we have no clue what this is, how long it's going to last, what it's going to look like, and then the research that was coming out, it's just been really fascinating to me, that it's just really profound. And I think the thing I hope that eventually we take away from this is that how profoundly connected we are.
Yes, absolutely. And that we are more dependent upon each other than we realized in ways that are both hopeful and terrifying.
Yes.
Right. We are so bound together.
Yes.
One of the things that I didn't talk about in the sermon, and I may mention it this coming week, and we talked a little bit about this earlier as well, is this dynamic of kind of broken relationships, and certainly on the front end of this conversation in Lent, talking about the ways that we engage in behaviors that don't help with those broken relationships or actually cause some of the kind of the brokenness in our relationships. I think it's important to say that that some of this content isn't universally applicable, I guess, to every relationship all the time.
Yes.
And that there are circumstances where the brokenness of the relationship doesn't really fall equally, right? And there are broken relationships because some people are broken in ways that they themselves cause harm to others.
Yes.
And that it's not to say that if you're in a broken relationship, here are some easy steps to heal that relationship. In some cases, you need to protect yourself, and you need to take care of yourself and acknowledge the brokenness of the relationship, but not feel the burden of fixing that broken relationship.
Well, I shared with you, I had brought someone with me to the Ash Wednesday service, and we were leaving, and they were just like, I don't know what that Randall guy was talking about forgiving people, but I'm not going to forgive them. And it was really, it was an amazing conversation that we had, because it was a way that they were able to process that people had hurt them and it was not their fault.
Yeah.
But that...
Yeah, and it's not their responsibility to heal that. Yeah.
But that forgiveness, it's like we had this really profound conversation about forgiveness, and I think a lot of it is our terminology. That forgiveness doesn't mean that you're saying, I forgive you and it's okay, right? It's not okay. Like so many of the things that have happened are not okay, and I've really had to talk a lot with kids in foster care about that, because like forgiveness is for us, it's for our soul. But if somebody has really violated you, wounded you, that trauma with that, forgiveness is not saying that's okay.
Right.
Forgiveness is saying it was not okay, and I'm going to give myself the gift in forgiving you. But it doesn't mean necessarily reconciliation or, you know, and I know for me, working with kids in trauma has radically changed the way that because I always hear how something would sound, you know, but it's like I was telling them, like, but forgiveness is for you. Like, it's for your soul, you know? So I gave them ashes and said, you will need these one day.
One day, yeah.
But it might not be now, but you need them.
Yeah. And I think that's an important distinction to make as we're going forward into the season of Lent, that sometimes the broken relationships are not healed by repairing those relationships or bringing those relationships back together. Sometimes the healing comes outside of those relationships.
Yes.
And that's
and grieving. The loss of those relationships.
Yeah.
Like, there are some relationships that need to be grieved and let go.
Yeah.
And you know, for me with, you know, youth of, you know, them, you know, kids in foster care asking me, like, did my mommy and daddy not want me? Did they just not love me? Did they, you know, I would have foster parents tell them, oh, well, they love drugs more than you. And I'm like, come on now. Like, you know, they're addicts. It's, you know, that changes the rules, right?
Yeah.
And that, you know, but to, you know, I would say, you know, a better way to frame this for them is, you know, it is very difficult to deal with addiction.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't mean they don't love you. A lot of it has to do with themselves, and they're not themselves.
Yeah.
And I don't know if they will be themselves. And, you know, I've had to have conversations with kids of, like, you know, their parents making them promises that they wouldn't keep, and then having to say to them, like, your mommy and daddy are not going to be able to be in your life anymore. And I'm like, how do you do that? But it's, you know, I've seen healing in that, of being able to help them to realize, like, your mommy and daddy love you, but they have problems.
Mm-hmm. And I think, I mean, looking ahead to this coming Sunday's topic, which is negative interpretation and assuming positive intent, is particularly when it comes to our parents. I mean, you know, even you know, healthy parents, you know, have impacts on their children.
Yes.
And I think, you know, sometimes recognizing that, oh my gosh, you know, my parents did the best they could, you know, and everybody makes mistakes, right? Everybody says things they regret. Everybody does things that they regret. It's infinitely harder if you are struggling yourself with addiction or, you know, generational poverty or cycles of abuse or, you know, all the things mental illness and all the things that make life even that much more complicated. But, you know, oh my goodness, I mean, again, almost all of us, almost all the time, are really sincerely trying to do the best we can. Mm-hmm. Even in our brokenness, even in our failings, even in the harm that we do to each other, the ways that we dismiss each other, you know, almost all of the time, almost all of us are genuinely trying to be the best person that we can be. And what does it take to sort of flip that around and say, this person with whom I disagree, this person who's rubbing me the wrong way, that they are trying to be the best person they can be. And recognize that and honor that. Is I mean, and it is so infinitely harder as a child to see your parents make mistakes, you know, cause harm even if they don't intend to cause harm. But if there's mental illness, addiction, you know, those kinds of things in play as well. Everybody's just trying to do their best, and sometimes it's just not enough.
And clearly, what you were saying about how, you know, at the beginning of how when you harm people, it does something to you. Right. It makes me think a lot of like Harry Potter and the Horcruxes. Like there's some real deep truth in that.
Yes.
That when there is harm that you can wrought on someone else that I really believe does something to your soul. And, DG and I, my husband is like the eternal optimist, right? And he always talks about, assume positive intent. And me, I'm kind of like the eternal realist. But I've worked with people that have done horrific things. And we talk a lot about, he'll be like, assume positive intent. And I'm like, but what if the intent is not positive? Mm-hmm. And I struggle with that.
Yeah.
I really do that, because I've worked with like teenage sex offenders that it's like their intent is not positive.
Yes,
but what I see is there are layers back to where there were decisions made or things done to them, that really like, and it's the reason why it's so important how we treat one another, because we do not, I don't think we can calculate the harm that we can do to someone else.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. Really heavy stuff. And I shared in my sermon. I was not planning on doing a Lenten series on broken relationships. Had other things planned, but I'm so thankful that we're taking this season to do some of this work, because people are really wrestling with some of this stuff. People have come up to me after Sunday, and really, you can tell that it's
emotions it elicits.
And the emotions. And like I said in my sermon on Sunday, this is probably the most pastoral topic I've ever picked up.
Yeah.
Particularly for this moment, because I think so many of us have experienced so much brokenness in our families, in our culture, in society. And we're just, so many of us feel helpless of what do we do with this. And so hopefully this will be a healing kind of conversation over the next few weeks for us, and some opportunities to explore how to bring about reconciliation, or at least to see each other through different eyes.
And hopefully get some peace. Like I just pray that, people are able to find some peace.
Well, our world could find some peace. We need it. Well, we've talked around a lot of things, and we looked ahead to next week already. Anything else? Takeaways? It's
a profound. I think that God is doing a lot of healing through this.
Yeah, I think so too. And I'm all that much more grateful for having this resource, this topic kind of fall into my lap the way it did. Thinking, this is really useful and really important and really timely. And looking forward to more conversations. Thanks for joining us on Preaching Unpacked. We'll see you next time when we talk about negative interpretation and assuming positive intent, and assuming that everybody is really trying their best, even if you disagree with them. Thanks for joining us.